Imagine an animal that turns almost every calorie it eats into meat faster than any farm animal alive. It matures in months, not years. It reproduces so quickly that a single pair could, in theory, produce hundreds of descendants within a single year. Its meat is lean, high in protein, and gentle on the body. By almost every measure that matters to a hungry planet, this animal should be sitting on dinner plates everywhere. And yet, in much of the world, it isn't. The animal is the rabbit. And the story of why we largely left it off the menu is stranger and more human than you'd expect. Start with the efficiency itself, because it really is remarkable. A rabbit can convert roughly 3 to 4 pounds of feed into a single pound of body weight. A cow, by comparison, needs somewhere around 6 to 8 pounds of feed to produce that same pound of meat, nearly twice as much. Rabbits don't need vast grazing land. They don't produce anywhere near the methane that cattle do. A doe can give birth to a new litter roughly every month, with each litter containing anywhere from 6 to 10 kits. Mathematically, no farm animal comes close to this kind of return. So why does the thought of rabbit meat feel unfamiliar, even faintly wrong to so many people? Part of the answer begins somewhere you wouldn't expect: the frozen edges of the Arctic, more than a century ago. Explorers venturing into the far north sometimes found themselves stranded with almost nothing to eat but rabbit. It seemed like a stroke of luck. Rabbits were plentiful, lean, and easy to catch, but something started going wrong. Men who ate rabbit meat and little else began falling ill. They developed diarrhea, headaches, exhaustion, and a strange, desperate hunger that no amount of rabbit could satisfy. Some grew critically weak. In extreme cases, people died. The condition became known informally as rabbit starvation. Here's the twist. It wasn't a lack of food that was killing them, it was the opposite. They were eating plenty, but their bodies were being poisoned by protein itself. Rabbit meat is almost entirely lean protein, with very little fat. The human liver can only break down a limited amount of protein per day. Without enough fat or carbohydrates to balance the load, the body can't keep up, and toxic byproducts of protein metabolism begin to build up in the bloodstream. In other words, the most efficient meat on the planet could, if eaten alone, kill the very people trying to survive on it. That single fact reshaped how many cultures viewed rabbit. It wasn't seen as a reliable staple, but as a supplement, something eaten alongside fattier meats, never in place of them. Efficiency on paper didn't translate into trust at the table. But biology only explains part of the story. The rest is far more psychological. For centuries, rabbits occupied a strange dual identity in the human imagination. In parts of Europe, they were farmed and eaten without hesitation. In fact, there's a curious episode from medieval history, long repeated but now considered more legend than fact, involving monks who were said to have classified newborn rabbit fetuses as a kind of fish. According to the story, because the unborn kits were surrounded by fluid in the womb, not unlike a creature of the water, some religious communities argued they could be eaten during periods when meat was forbidden. Researchers have since traced the tale to a mix-up between two medieval writers who happened to share the name Gregory, with no real evidence any pope ever issued such a ruling. Still, the legend reflects something real. For a long time, humans weren't entirely sure how to categorize the rabbit. Was it livestock? Was it something else? That uncertainty eventually tipped in an unexpected direction, not toward the farm, but toward the living room. As pet ownership spread through the 19th and 20th centuries, rabbits became one of the most common companion animals in Western homes. Soft fur, twitching noses, gentle temperaments. Children grew up naming them, cuddling them, mourning them when they died. A creature that might have made perfect sense as livestock instead became emotionally reclassified as something closer to a member of the family. And once an animal crosses that invisible line, from food to companion, the thought of eating it can trigger genuine discomfort. Not because the meat is unsafe or unpleasant, but because the brain has filed that animal under a completely different category. Psychologists call this the meat paradox, the uncomfortable tension between loving animals and eating them, and few creatures expose that tension as sharply as the rabbit. Then, in the 20th century, something happened that pushed rabbit even further from public appetite. In the 1950s, a disease called myxomatosis was deliberately introduced into wild rabbit populations, first in Australia, then in Europe, as a way to control exploding rabbit numbers that were devastating crops. The disease was horrifying to witness. Infected rabbits developed grotesque swelling, blindness, and slow, visible suffering before dying. For a public that had once eaten rabbit regularly, especially during wartime shortages when it was a dependable source of protein, the sight of diseased rabbits littering fields created a wave of disgust that lingered for decades. Sales of rabbit meat collapsed in places like Britain and barely recovered. Layered on top of that was a quieter, more social shift. In the years after the war, rabbit meat had been a symbol of hardship, something families ate because they had to, not because they wanted to. As economies improved and beef, pork, and chicken became more affordable, rabbit meat carried an unwanted association with poverty and rationing. People didn't just stop eating it, they actively distanced themselves from a food that reminded them of leaner years. So by the time science began pointing back toward rabbit as one of the most sustainable, efficient sources of protein on Earth, culture had already closed the door. The animal had become a pet, a symbol of hard times, and a casualty of a horrifying disease, all wrapped into one deeply unappetizing package. Which brings us to something worth sitting with. We tend to assume that human food choices follow logic, that if something is efficient, healthy, and abundant, we'll naturally gravitate toward it. But the rabbit tells a different story. Somewhere between biology, memory, and emotion, we decided what counts as food long before we ever calculated what should. The most efficient animal on the farm never had a chance, not because it failed some scientific test, but because it looked too much like something we already loved.